In the last couple of videos, we looked at Joash and how he was preserved as a child and eventually raised to the throne at 7 years old. And things began well with him, but he falls into apostasy and is later assassinated. And so a king who rose to the throne by conspiracy is disposed of by conspiracy. And so the kingdom falls to Amaziah, his son. And we read in verse 1, Amaziah was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. And we'll come back to that. His mother's name was Jehoadan of Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, yet not with a whole heart. And as soon as the royal power was firmly his, and this is one of our key terms we've seen over and over, he was established, he was made strong, those kinds of ideas, he killed his servants who had struck down the king his father. But he did not put their children to death, according to what is written in the law in the book of Moses, where the Lord commanded, fathers shall not die because of their children, nor children die because of their fathers, but each one shall die for his own sin. It's very interesting that they actually include the quotation of the law. I wonder if it's not some kind of foreshadowing, basically, because we're going to find Amaziah is going to incur plenty of guilt himself. And there will be political intrigues and conspiracies and things like that. But to begin with, this 29 years in Jerusalem, Klein is going to point out in his commentary the chronological data on the length of the king's reigns in this period is confusing. And this confusion is compounded if one includes the synchronisms with the north, which the chronicler routinely omits. This is not the place to resolve the differences between these two chronologies, but only to observe that the biblical data cannot be turned into absolute chronologies without positing co-regencies, even where they are not attested in the Bible, changing some of the biblical numbers or both. Now, at the very end of this, I want to actually go into some of that. Usually I haven't been doing that, but this is a good point to do it for multiple reasons. Namely, this is the area where things kind of get the weirdest, but if you take Till's reconstruction, everything then snaps back into place, though. So there may be an answer for this. We will save that for the end. And worth noting here is this whole heart language. First, it creates a pun with Jerusalem, and it also brings back to mind Solomon's name, but maybe more specifically, it has hooks back to earlier in 2nd Chronicles. We're told how the Lord's eyes move around to and fro on the earth, and he supports those who are whole in heart or whatever. It's this term shalom, obviously related to shalom. And Lightheart actually points that out, that if you seek with a whole heart, again, shalom, you get shalom, you get peace. And it should probably also be noted here that when he has these people put to death, the conspirators, concerning this, Johnstone says, the first step is the confirmation of the new king in his position, to purge the guilt of his father's murder, and no doubt to clear himself of any suspicion of complicity in the act. He has the assassins put to death. But he follows the law as he should. It's one of those interesting things because there is a sense in which you feel like you understand why they did what they did, but it's still required that the law be applied to them. Although, once again, there may be a bit of foreshadowing in a sense here, because the tail end of this chapter, we're going to see a similar kind of assassination play out, and those conspirators are not put to death, which is kind of interesting. But continuing down to verse 5, first we'll look at Johnstone here, and he has the structure more or less of this chapter. And as you can see, it's very symmetrical overall. Of course, we're going to have Amaziah properly listen, and then, of course, he's going to squander any good he does by not listening and by doing illicit things in the worship domain. But verse 5 reads, Then Amaziah assembled the men of Judah and set them by fathers' houses under commanders by thousands and of hundreds for all Judah and Benjamin. He mustered those 20 years old and upward, and found that they were 300,000 choice men fit for war, able to handle spear and shield. Now, this is interesting. I think it becomes important is here we have the mustered language, PQD. Again, it's that census kind of language. Of course, we don't have anything here about him paying a tax or doing anything by Mosaic law. That may be very important for the rest of this narrative. Because what he's going to do is he's going to hire, in verse 6, 100,000 mighty men of valor from Israel for 100 talents of silver. It is going to be critiqued for doing this. And Johnstone in his commentary does the math here about what this would look like, this number would look like if they had followed the tax. And he says a force of 300,000 would pay 50 talents of silver, and that sum should be devoted to the maintenance of the sanctuary. It is precisely double this amount that Amaziah proposes to misapply in hiring 100,000 troops from the north. And he says, no wonder the unnamed man of God in verse 7 is outraged. I don't think that that's coincidental. It is very interesting. He doesn't take the tax, at least we're not told that he did. And instead, he uses that money that should go to the temple, and he ends up paying a mercenary force. And this is a major theme in Chronicles about not relying on the other nations. And of course, Israel at this point is now just one of the other nations. As Johnstone, of course, quoting the text here, God is not with them anymore. The Emmanuel promise and the prophecy doesn't apply to Israel right now. And so the man of God says in verse 7, O king, do not let the army of Israel go with you, for the Lord is not with Israel. Again, that's that Emmanuel kind of language with all of these Ephraimites. And then verse 8, but go, act, be strong for the battle. Why should you suppose that God will cast you down before the enemy? For God has power to help or to cast down. And what's interesting is this language here in verse 8, but go, act, is actually kind of odd, the way it's stated. It's quite literally telling him go alone, basically. As Selman points out, the actual Hebrew is ironic. Go by yourself and act, be strong in battle. And it's ironic because he says God is not with them. The Lord is not with Israel, but go alone, he tells him. So there's this sense in which if he goes alone, that is without Israel, he's not going to be alone. So literally it's kind of odd and ironic, but theologically, this is right in line with the chronicler, relying on God instead of relying on the power and the strength of your alliances and the other nations. And so Johnstone says, once again, the choice for the sacramental figure is a stark either or. Amaziah must go alone in verse 8, in which case he will be strong. And then Amaziah is going to question, well, what do I do with this money that I've paid this mercenary force? And the man of God basically is going to tell him, hey, just eat the cost. The Lord can give you much more than this. And so Amaziah dismisses the army, and they're upset, presumably because they're cut out of the spoils from war. They get paid this sum, yeah, but they want the spoils from war, and they're not going to get any of that. And then we get down to verse 11, but Amaziah took courage and led out his people and went to the valley of Salt and struck down 10,000 men of Seir. The men of Judah captured another 10,000 alive and took them to the top of a rock and threw them down from the top of the rock, and they were all dashed to pieces. But the men of the army whom Amaziah sent back, not letting them go with him to battle, so this is the army of Israel, they raided the cities of Judah from Samaria to Beth Horon and struck down 3,000 people in them and took much spoil. So they get their spoils, but it comes at the cost of some of the cities of Judah. And here Johnstone is discussing the lack of motivation, or the motive that you get in Kings and Chronicles, or rather you don't get. We're not told why this battle takes place, but there is actually a good reason why he would want to do this. And basically it's economic. They need to reopen the trade routes and that kind of thing. So it's for control of this location, again, assuming certain geographical details. But that does make a lot of sense why this battle would be taking place. And so right on the heels of this victory, where he listens to the words of the prophet, and he goes down, he's victorious. And then verse 14, after Amaziah came from striking down the Edomites, he brought the gods of the men of Seir and set them up as his gods and worshipped them, making offerings to them. Therefore the Lord was angry with Amaziah and sent to him a prophet who said to him, why have you sought the gods of a people who did not deliver their own people from your hand? But as he was speaking, the king said to him, have we made you a royal counselor? Stop. Why should you be struck down? So the prophet stopped, but he said, I know that God has determined to destroy you because you have done this and have not listened to my counsel. In a bit of interesting foreshadowing here in verse 15. So the Lord sends a prophet right here. And this is going to foreshadow the sending of messages back and forth between the kings. And of course, this all foreshadows the end of Amaziah when they sinned after Amaziah and put him to death. So, spoiler alert, he gets assassinated. But it all begins with the Lord sending Amaziah, who's now rebellious. He sends him a prophet. And he has so many opportunities to turn away from his folly, but he never does. He doesn't listen. Again, you see a lot of this language, especially this counsel language that we get into here. He says, have we made you a royal counselor? And so it's going to cluster references to this language here. I know that God has determined to destroy you. It's the same underlying language. It would sound really clunky to say that God has counseled to destroy you. That might not be a terrible translation, because this brings to mind, a lot of this story brings to mind Jehoshaphat and Ahab. But now Amaziah is in the Ahab role. And where we saw there that God had counseled, he counseled with his divine counsel to put an end to Ahab. Here, now, because he does not listen. He doesn't listen. He doesn't shema the counsel that the prophet that God sent him. The Lord has now counseled to destroy him. Whether this actually involves the divine counsel, who knows? But it is interesting. I think it is rather thematically linked. And then we move down to verse 17 and following. It should be noted, by the way, that the sections, verses 1 through 16, are 17 times 17 words. And even on a letter level, it's 45 times 26 letters, of course, our other divine number. And then in the next section, 17 through 24, is 149 words, not relevant numerically, I guess, but 598 is 23 times 26. So again, on the letter level. And these sections are marked off by paragraph breaks in the Masoretic text. So our English translations don't always bring out when the Masoretic text is hitting a paragraph break. But it is rather interesting that we get this kind of stuff in this structure. But we get down to verse 17, and after this battle, Amaziah is going to get a little bit arrogant. So then Amaziah, king of Judah, took counsel. So there we are back with this counsel language. It picks right back up. And he sends word to Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, king of Israel. It gives us probably this mini biography because Joash is actually the name of Amaziah's father. He was the child that was delivered. It gets really confusing because they share a lot of names. But this is the king of the north, not to be confused with his father. But Amaziah says to him, "Come, let us look one another in the face." What exactly this means, nobody really knows. The only other occurrence happens further down in verse 21 and also Genesis 42, but it's not really clear what it means. Is it like a challenge? It's probably a challenge. And then moving down to verse 18, Joash, the king of Israel, sent word. So again, we're back to that sending back and forth language that we got back earlier with the prophet. But he says to Amaziah, "A thistle on Lebanon sent to a cedar on Lebanon, saying, 'Give your daughter to my son for a wife.' And a wild beast of Lebanon passed by and trampled down the thistle. You say, 'See, I have struck down Edom, and your heart is lifted up in boastfulness. But now stay at home. Why should you provoke trouble so that you fall, you and Judah with you?'" This is really interesting because as we look at Till, he's going to read between the lines and kind of give something of an expanded narrative, but it makes sense. I guess I could give you the conclusion here already. He believes that they started off on friendly terms. Again, kind of like Jehoshaphat and Ahab, and they had this joint campaign against Edom, because remember, he hires the mercenaries from Israel, but at the last minute, he cuts them out of the deal, and then they go back and they start raiding towns in Judah. And so now the relationship has soured. Till suggests that a marriage alliance was proposed by Amaziah to Joash. And so he gives him back kind of this taunt, calling him a thistle and saying, "You come to me with this marriage alliance." So he's rejecting him, he's rejecting the alliance. And what he gives him is actually good advice. Stay at home. Again, we've seen this over and over. The king of Jerusalem should not be leaving. He should be tending to his own flock. Of course, they're always getting their nose in other people's business, and it always ends poorly for them. Why should you provoke trouble so that you fall? So we're to that stumbling kind of language. But what's interesting is this actually picks up some of the Deuteronomy language about not provoking your neighbors. they had certain situations where they weren't supposed to harass or attack other people that the Lord hadn't given them. So it's saying, don't attack them. I've not given them into your hands. Just pass them by or whatever. And so he actually picks that language up here. And so, in a sense, God is speaking now through the king of Israel, through this apostate, but he's giving him good counsel. But down to verse 20, Amaziah would not listen. Again, he would not shema. But why would he not shema now? For it was of God, in order that he might give them into the hand of their enemies. Now, if you're a Calvinist, you say amen, and this is a great proof text. But continue reading, because they had sought the gods of Edom. So this is why they're in judgment. This is why his ears are now closed, because he didn't listen to the prophet when he fell into idolatry. The Lord sent him a prophet. He didn't listen. And so now the Lord has closed his ears. He won't listen. And so now he's going to pay for this sin, which I don't believe God decreed this part of it, that he would seek the gods of Edom. But God has decreed this, though, in response. So this is the free choice of Amaziah, and this is God's response to harden his heart. And so the kings meet each other at Beth Shemesh, which would be something like the house of the sun. And Judah is defeated, and they flee, and Joash is going to capture Amaziah. And they push to Jerusalem, and they break down the walls, and they seize gold and silver vessels in the house of God in the care of Obed Edom. And he seized also the treasures of the king's house, also hostages, and he returned to Samaria. And so he's captured, and the temple is raided. And this is actually really interesting, because it suddenly brings back Obed Edom into the picture. And Klein has an interesting observation. He says, Rudolph pointed out that the reference to Obed Edom is missing in the Latin, blah, blah, blah. However, that may be. Japhet makes the helpful observation that Amaziah, who had worshipped the gods of Edom, now ironically loses treasures that were under the control of a man whose name means in Hebrew, worshiper of Edom. We talked about this back whenever we first introduced Obed Edom in First Chronicles, that's what his name meant. And there were some who questioned, was he actually a priest of Edom who came under the priesthood of the Lord? And who knows? But that is what his name means. And it is deeply ironic that I think it does so for this purpose. It's an irony that's brought out by his name. And so whether it's an actual genetic link, some people do wonder, is this a descendant of Obed Edom? Or is it just bringing back to mind the original man in this position, the caretaker of these things, is being evoked so as to bring out that irony that he has now fallen into worship of these other false gods. But kind of odd and interesting that 2 centuries have passed and his name shows up for the first and only time in Second Chronicles. And then we kind of get into some of the biographical notes here at the very end, and it gets kind of confusing, and this is why we kind of need to go and look at Till here in a minute. But Amaziah, son of Joash, king of Judah, lived 15 years after the death of Joash. So he outlived the king of the north, even though he was conquered and carried off as a hostage. And then it gets into the biographical details, now the rest of the deeds, so on and so forth. And then verse 27, from the time when he turned away from the Lord, they made a conspiracy against him. In Jerusalem, he fled to Lachish. And they sent after him to Lachish, and they put him to death there. And they brought him upon horses, and he was buried with his fathers in the city of David. So there's a couple of biographical kind of things to note here. And one thing we should actually point out is when we flow into the next section here, because the paragraph break in the Masoretic text is up here, so it actually continues down. And we do need to read this here, that all of the people took Uzziah, his son, who was 16 years old, and made him king instead of his father, Amaziah. That's interesting the way it puts that. Because as strange as this end is, I think Till's reconstruction makes sense of it all. And so now we're going to look at Till's book, a couple of pages that I've clipped out for us. Now, when we're dealing with chronology, we have to keep in mind 2 major things. First, how do we reckon what the first year of a king's reign is? There are 2 methods of counting. One is the accession year system. This method counts the accession, the year they ascended to the throne, separately. Think of it as like a year 0. So you'd have the year that they ascend to the throne, they take up the throne, and that last that year, whatever it is, then after that, you'd get year 1, year 2, etc. The other method is the non-accession year system, and that simply begins counting as soon as the king takes up the throne. And that means that a non-accession year system is always going to be 1 year ahead or 1 year higher than the accession system because they don't have that year 0, basically. So you could have 2 different kings come to the throne on the same day. And let's take, 3 years later, for example, the non-accession king would be in year 3, while the accession year king would be considered year 2 because they had, that year 0. So a further question, though, to consider is, do you count from the day they took the throne, or does a new year start on New Year's Day? If it's the latter, you have 2 more options, and that's Nisan in the spring or Tishri in fall. And so these are the kinds of things that we have to consider when we're thinking about chronology. So it's not as simple as just saying this king reigned X amount of years or whatever, because there's all these factors that come into play. And so here we have a diagram that shows this. So you have a accession year system, and then you have the non-accession year system. And note how they're always going to be 1 year off. Again, because this one counts that year they come to the throne as its own year. Like I said, it's basically like a year 0. But once we add the additional question of what is the new year, is it Nisan or Tishri, that adds even more possibilities. And so now he picks up with like a hypothetical situation. And again, if you're dealing with a situation like this where one is using Tishri, the other one's using Nisan, note how you're going to have a period of time where they parallel each other, but you're going to have a time where the Tishri king is already in year 2, where the Nisan king is still in year 1, again, because it happens sooner than the other. It's kind of like my brother is 2 years older than me. He's basically like 23 months older than me. But there is that 1 month where numerically we're 1 year apart, but in reality, we're really not that close. So you have that kind of thing going on here. Now, it gets far more muddy when you start throwing in non-accession and accession years and the Tishri issue. So he has this chart here, and I'll let you look at the chart and I'll kind of read it out for you. He says, here are the possible ways that this could be taken. So if the Judean ruler began his reign between Tishri and Nisan, so between fall and spring, and if he used Israel's non-accession year system for synchronizing his accession, he came to the throne in the 3rd year of the Israelite ruler. But if he used his own accession year system for that synchronism, he came to the throne in the 2nd year. If, however, he started his reign between Nisan and Tishri, so between spring and fall, and used Israel's non-accession year system for the synchronism, he came to the throne in the 4th year of Israel's king. Finally, if he used Judah's accession year system in expressing the synchronization, he commenced his reign in the 3rd year of Israel's king. So as you can see, something as simple as that, and that's actually simple, you have a lot of options of how you would take that. So it's not as simple as a king reigned this many years and there we can just count it up. And in fact, he's going to get into this, which I kind of want to park on because, like I said, this whole narrative is actually really important to this issue. So from Athaliah to Azariah, and Azariah is actually Uzziah from the next chapter. If you were to just count up their reign length, you would get 128 years. Now, over in Israel, they should come out to the same length, but obviously they don't here. It's 114. It's 13 and a half years too long. And we know this based off of their interactions with each other, as well as outside contemporary, like Assyrian sources, things like that, that we can pinpoint certain moments and say, okay, these years have to fit into this time span. And so the problems here are, again, they don't match up, and this should all take place roughly 100 years, in about 100 years. This one's basically like 25 years too long. This one's about a dozen or so years too long. So how do you find that? How do you chop off those extra years, right? So it's a big question. Nobody really knows what to do with it. But here's Till's explanation for this. And he's laying out the problem here in this section. And he finds an answer in the case of Israel by suggesting a co-regency of 12 years between Jeroboam II and Jehoash, or Joash, from our chapter. He was the king from the north in our chapter today. And in Judah, the overlapping 24 years of the reign of Azariah, that is Uzziah, with the years of his father Amaziah. So Amaziah was the king that was conquered and carried off, and they put the 16-year-old on the throne. And so what it's saying is basically you had co-regencies in both. And if you do that, and if this event is kind of that pivot point where you have the co-regencies, it would snap everything back into place. Those extra 25 and a dozen years fall off, and they fall to about 100 years. And then the two, Judah and Israel, would then be in symmetry with each other after, again, accounting for these differences. And so here on page 109, and I'll put this stuff on Ko-Fi so you can look at it, but we already went through this. He proposes they were on good terms, and presumably it's when they break off and send the mercenary force from the north back home that the relationship turns sour, and he rejects the marriage alliance here. And picking up down here, he says, when Amaziah returned from his triumphal campaign in Edom, he sent a challenge of war to Joash. This Joash declined with warning that Amaziah and Judah would be defeated. When Amaziah insisted on war, Joash invaded Judah. He took Amaziah prisoner, broke into Jerusalem, took hostages, and pillaged the palace and temple. The bizarre events of this episode explain the co-regency of Jeroboam II and Joash in Israel, and the overlap of Azariah, that is Uzziah, with Amaziah. Before starting out against the exultant Amaziah, who was fresh from his triumph in Edom, Joash, with thought for the future, placed his son Jeroboam on the throne as regent. In Judah, with Amaziah having been taken to Israel as a prisoner of war, the people placed the young Uzziah, on the vacant throne. And he continues, the fact that Uzziah, or Azariah, was raised to the throne at the age of 16 is recorded as a postscript to the account of Amaziah. In Chronicles, it happens in the next chapter. And here he's talking about in Kings. Chronologically, this item does not belong in 2 Kings 14:21. So chronologically, it doesn't belong there. Instead, it belongs after the events of verses 12 through 14. So really, if you were to place it chronologically, if you were to place it there, then you have Amaziah being taken prisoner, and then the 16-year-old son is placed as vice-regent, as the acting king during this time period. So you have the total year of Amaziah's reign is something long, but in reality, he only actually reigned like 4 or 5 years before his campaign and was then taken off in defeat. But it still counts his full 29 years. But if you compress that co-reign with those two, it takes out all those excess years that don't make sense. And additionally, I think it also makes sense of the end of this narrative, because you have that odd note where he finally gets assassinated at the very end when he flees to Lachish. And so Klein writes that there are some other scholars, Kogan and Tadmor, raise the possibility that Amaziah may have tried to regain full possession of the throne and remove Uzziah from his co-regency. The city of Lachish, some 28 to 30 miles from Jerusalem, had been one of the defense cities constructed by Rehoboam, and so Amaziah may have hoped to find a friendly reception there, even though he reigned more than a century after Rehoboam. The conspirators had connections to Lachish, however, and were able to have him killed. So that probably makes the most sense. He tries to regain sole possession and is then executed after having survived the king of the north, Joash, for a couple of years. He comes to this sad end. And with all of that, again, I would encourage you to check out some of the resources I'll make available. But that is chapter 25, and we will pick up with Uzziah in chapter 26 next time.